Let's start with the Suez Canal. It perfectly highlights how delicate global trade can be.
The Suez Canal. Such a narrow channel, but utterly vital. You've got, what, over 50 huge freighters passing through every single day.
That's right. And these aren't small vessels. We're talking up to 400 meters long, maybe 60 meters wide.
Huge.
Getting those through that space,
Yeah.
it's incredibly tricky work.
And we all saw what happens when it gets blocked, didn't we? The Ever Given in 2021.
Oh, absolutely. That one incident, blocking the canal,
Mm.
it held up something like $8 billion worth of goods every single day.
Wow. 8 billion a day.
It was, a stark reminder of how vulnerable trade is to these bottlenecks.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder about other weak spots in the system.
It really does. And it also, I think, gave us a peek into who holds the power in this industry.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like open trade on the high seas, but actually it's dominated by just a few massive companies.
Very few,
Hmm.
relatively speaking. And think about the size of the ships they operate now. Let's imagine one, say, the Mass McKinney Miller, inspired by giants like Maersk.
Okay.
This thing is enormous, like 4 football fields long.
4 football fields.
And if you laid it on its side, taller than the Eiffel Tower,
That's hard to even picture.
and the cargo it can carry. Imagine 150 big supermarkets, everything inside them. That's what one ship can hold.
Good grief. The scale is just phenomenal.
It'd have huge implications for logistics, for efficiency, everything.
And the people steering these things, the captains, the crew,
Yeah.
they're on voyages for months, right? Covering maybe 40,000 kilometers?
Yeah, with around 15 stops typically.
Huh.
And the value on board,
Must be huge.
a full load, could be around $700 million.
$700 million on one ship. That's the kind of capital flowing across the oceans constantly.
Exactly. But this whole, finely tuned system hit major turbulence with the pandemic.
Ah, yes, COVID-19. That changed everything for shipping, didn't it?
It really did. Suddenly, huge demand for goods, but disruptions everywhere. Workers, ports, logistics.
Ah.
It led to massive congestion.
And you could really feel the effects, couldn't you? Empty shelves in stores.
Absolutely. Electronic stores with no TVs, supermarkets missing fresh stuff, garden centers without furniture just when everyone wanted it.
I remember that. Trying to buy garden furniture in spring.
But it
Impossible.
wasn't isolated. It was happening everywhere. The system was just buckling under the strain.
And the ports. I remember seeing pictures of Los Angeles in, what was it, late 2021?
Yeah, fall 2021. It was gridlock. You had maybe 70 ships just anchored offshore,
70 ships just waiting.
waiting for up to 18 days just to get in and unload.
18 days. The knock-on effects must have been massive.
Oh, huge. Rippling right down the supply chain. Think about, say, a local bike shop.
Okay.
They're trying to get mountain bikes in stock,
Hmm.
but they're waiting months, literally months, for basic parts like tires or forks.
So they can't build the bikes they need to sell.
Exactly. They lose sales, lose revenue, all because the parts are stuck somewhere out at sea or in a jammed-up port.
And delivery times just exploded, right? Stuff from Asia used to take, what, a couple of months?
Yeah, typically. Suddenly it could take up to
A year.
a year in some cases. And at the same time, the price to ship a single container,
Mhm.
it went through the roof. Maybe 5 times higher than before the pandemic.
Wow. So huge delays and massive cost increases. A nightmare for businesses.
A real challenge. And it wasn't just importers feeling it. Exporters had problems too.
Right, like trying to ship things out.
Exactly. Take
Yep.
a potato distributor in Normandy, for example.
Oh, okay.
They suddenly couldn't get enough empty containers to ship their potatoes. We're talking about potentially losing the sale of 5,000 tons of potatoes.
5,000 tons. That's a huge hit.
It is. And think about the individual farmer in that chain. We heard about one guy who couldn't get his potato harvest shipped to Egypt.
So he's facing financial losses.
Big time. And maybe even thinking about cutting back on exports next year because it's just too unreliable or expensive.
It really shows how these shipping issues hit right down to the ground level, affecting livelihoods.
Absolutely. And it all circles back to the power concentrated in the hands of just a few shipping lines.
How concentrated are we talking?
Well, get this. The top 9 companies control over 80% of all global container shipping.
80%, just 9 companies.
And the top 3, mostly European companies, have almost half the market, 47%.
That's incredible market share.
It really is. And it has implications. During the pandemic, while lots of industries struggled, these shipping giants saw their profits soar.
How much are we talking?
Around $180 billion in profit in 2021 alone.
Whoa, $180 billion, while freight rates were skyrocketing.
Precisely. And interestingly, at the same time, Service reliability plummeted.
Right, you mentioned the delays.
Take a big port like Hamburg. At one point, over half the ships arriving were late.
Over half. That must cause chaos.
Total chaos. It disrupts the whole port schedule, the trucks, the trains, everything. And port managers there were quite vocal, actually.
What did they say?
They basically blamed the shipping companies directly for the unreliable schedules.
Interesting. So the port's pointing fingers at the shipping lines?
Yes. And this unreliability was made worse by something called blank sailings.
Blank sailings. What's that?
It's when a shipping line just cancels a scheduled stop at a port.
Okay, but surely that happens sometimes. Bad weather or something.
It does, yeah. For things like weather or big delays. But what people noticed was an increase in these blank sailings beyond the usual reasons.
So companies just deciding to skip ports.
Essentially, yes. Effectively reducing the shipping capacity available on certain routes.
Why would they do that?
Well, reducing supply when demand is high tends to push up prices. And it certainly contributed to schedule instability. Global schedule reliability dropped dramatically.
How much?
It went from about 80% reliable in 2019 down to just 40% in 2021.
40%. That's unreliable, is putting it mildly.
It made planning incredibly difficult for businesses.
And this reduction in capacity, deliberate or not, combined with high demand, that explains the price hikes.
It's certainly a major factor. That cost for a container from Asia to Europe jumping from maybe a 1,000 to over 10,000.
A tenfold increase. Just staggering.
Understandably, this led to some pretty strong accusations.
I can imagine.
You had exporters, suggesting the shipping lines were deliberately holding back capacity simply to inflate prices.
Really? Like artificially creating scarcity?
That was the claim. One exporter even called them a mafia. Strong words.
Wow, that's a serious allegation. Did the industry respond?
Of course. The International Chamber of Shipping, their industry body, pushed back.
What was their argument?
They pointed the finger back at the ports, saying port inefficiencies and bottlenecks were the real cause of the delays.
So, blaming the ports again.
And we also heard from a manager at Maersk, one of the biggest players.
And then take.
They said their ships were full, running at maximum capacity, and that they were actually trying to increase capacity.
Okay, so different perspectives on who or what was to blame. It's complicated.
Very, and it did attract some regulatory attention, at least in the U.S.
Oh, what happened there?
There were investigations launched in 2021 looking into potential illegal price fixing.
And did they find anything?
Ultimately, no conclusive findings came out of those investigations. Interestingly, there seemed to be less action in the EU.
Really? Despite European companies being dominant?
Yeah, which caused some concern. The European Transport Workers Federation, for instance, kept pushing the EU Commission to investigate.
What were they alleging?
Abuse of market power, misconduct.
Right.
But they said they faced resistance getting a formal investigation going.
So, frustration there about a lack of EU action.
Definitely. Now, maybe we should shift focus a bit to another really important but often hidden aspect.
Okay, what's that?
The actual seafarers, the people working on these ships.
Right. What about their conditions?
Well, a huge number of ships sail under what are called flags of convenience.
Flags of convenience, like Panama or Liberia.
Exactly. Or places like Vanuatu, countries that offer ship owners low taxes and, crucially, less strict regulations.
Less strict regulations, including for labor.
That's often the case, unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
These ships might be older, maybe have poorer safety records.
And frequent owner changes, perhaps.
That too. And crucially, these flags often allow owners to operate with minimal crew numbers.
Which means the crew they do have are overworked.
Often overworked and underpaid. We saw examples of basic salaries around $522 in a month.
$522 for a trained seaman.
Which works out to maybe $2.72 an hour. It shows the kind of cost-cutting involved.
That's incredibly low. And what are the conditions like on board?
They can be really bad. We heard about spoiled food, lack of fresh water, and a really big issue: delayed or unpaid wages.
Unpaid wages. How does that happen?
It's a serious problem. There was this ship, the Ali Bay, stuck in Constantine, Romania since 2020.
With crew on board.
Yeah, 4 crew members just waiting unpaid for wages they're owed. It's heartbreaking.
That's awful. Just stranded.
And there are even worse stories. Captain Abdullah Dar, also stuck in Constantine, but for 28 months.
28 months on his ship.
Yes. Reportedly got only 10% of his pay in that time and couldn't leave because of visa issues.
My goodness. Trapped.
Then there was Mansour, a mechanic. waiting for $17,500 in unpaid wages.
17,000 euros.
And because of this, he'd been separated from his fiancée back in Syria for 2.5 years. These aren't just stories. They're real people trapped in awful situations.
It sounds like exploitation.
It certainly appears that some owners target vulnerable seafarers, maybe from countries in crisis, like Syria.
Because they're less likely to complain.
Exactly. They fear losing even that precarious job. And the scale. In 2021 alone, over 80 cargo ships were just abandoned by their owners.
Abandoned, leaving the crew behind.
Leaving them stranded, often unpaid, with no way home.
You might think this only happens with shady, small-time operators.
But that's not entirely true. Even the big European lines like CMA CGM use flags of convenience extensively.
Really? How many of their ships?
The vast majority. Nearly 600 of their ships fly flags of convenience.
Nearly 600. Wow.
And even on the few ships they have flying, say, the French flag, you find very few actual French seafarers.
So who crews these ships then?
They recruit globally and pay wages based on the seafarers' home country standards, which are often much lower than European ones.
So significant wage differences.
Huge! We saw an example. A sailor from Myanmar on a French-flagged ship, earning way below minimum wage, working crazy hours.
Do we have specific figures?
Documentation from early 2022 showed CMA CGM offered Filipino sailors a minimum of $965 a month for a 65-hour week.
$965 for 65 hours? What's that per hour?
Works out to about 3.30 an hour.
€3.30. That's incredibly low for that kind of work.
It highlights the labor cost savings. We even heard from an officer on one of their ships, anonymously, of course.
What did they say?
Alleged systematic exploitation, all aimed at maximizing profit.
Did the company respond to these kinds of claims?
We asked for interviews, statements on their foreign labor practices. They declined.
So no comment.
No comment. And technically, these practices might fall within the lines drawn by international maritime law, governed by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization.
But it still raises serious ethical questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. About fairness, about exploitation in a global industry.
Okay, so we've covered trade disruption, market power, labor conditions. What about the environment? Shipping must have a big impact there.
A massive impact. And this brings us to places like the Marshall Islands.
The Pacific Island nation.
Yes. Very low-lying, extremely vulnerable to climate change, rising sea levels.
So they have a direct stake in reducing emissions.
An existential stake.
Yeah.
They've been pushing hard at the IMO for stricter controls on greenhouse gas emissions from ships.
What were they asking for initially?
Their first proposal was a 50% cut by 2050. But they argued, rightly, that even that wasn't enough.
So they pushed for more.
They did.
Yeah.
They proposed zero emissions from shipping by 2050, a much tougher target.
0 by 2050. How does that compare to what's actually happening?
Well, currently, emissions from container shipping are actually increasing, not decreasing.
Increasing. Oh, dear.
Now, there was some movement. At the Glasgow Climate Conference, 14 countries, including France and Germany, pledged to decarbonize shipping by 2050.
Okay, that sounds promising.
But then, just weeks later at the IMO meeting,
Yes.
they rejected the Marshall Islands zero-emission proposal.
Rejected it even after those pledges.
Yes, and critically, France's representative voted against the zero-emission goal.
France voted against it. After pledging decarbonization in Glasgow, that seems contradictory.
It certainly drew criticism. Environmental groups call it out as double standards.
I can see why.
They pointed to the strong influence of the fossil fuel lobby and the shipping industry itself within the IMO.
Suggesting that industry influence is blocking stronger climate action.
That's the accusation, yes.
Yeah.
That it's hindering more ambitious targets.
And the environmental impact isn't just emissions, is it? What happens when these huge ships get old?
That's another major issue. Ship breaking. Dismantling old ships.
Where does that happen?
Often in developing countries, particularly India, places like Alang.
And the conditions there?
Often terrible. Safety regulations, environmental protection, frequently lacking or just not enforced.
Is it legal for European ships to end up there?
Well, there's a loophole. Ships often change their flag to a flag of convenience right before their final voyage.
Ah, the flag change again?
And they're sold to intermediaries called cash buyers. This makes it harder to trace responsibility back to the original European owner and bypasses stricter EU recycling rules.
And the work itself is dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. High rates of accidents, injuries, even deaths. We heard one account estimating 300 or 400 deaths witnessed over 20 years in those yards.
Good heavens, that's appalling.
And the pollution. Oil, asbestos, heavy metals leaching into the environment.
Where does the waste go?
Wastewater often goes straight into the sea. Solid waste gets buried or burned nearby. Local communities suffer from contaminated drinking water. Tests show really high pollutant levels.
So these cash buyers are key to this process.
They are. They buy the ship, take on the risk, and sell it to the yard, obscuring the original owner. And the financial incentive is strong.
Cheaper than responsible recycling.
Much cheaper. Owners get significantly more money selling to a cash buyer for scrapping in South Asia than they would paying for proper recycling in, say, Europe.
Has this involved major companies too?
There are allegations concerning Maersk, for example,
What's alleged?
that they've sent 12 ships to Alang since 2017, 2 as recently as 2021, sometimes after changing the ship's flag just before.
What does Maersk say about that?
They state they adhere to higher standards, monitor the yards they use for safety and environmental protection.
But worker testimonies contradict that.
Often, yes. Workers describe poor safety, injuries, fatalities, even in yards used by major companies. There's a real disconnect there.
So despite all these issues, labor, environment, market power, the industry is still growing.
It's booming. Huge numbers of new megaships are on order. This whole complex, sometimes murky system isn't going away, it's expanding.
Which raises fundamental questions about sustainability, doesn't it?
Absolutely. About the real cost of everything we consume.
So wrapping this up, it's clear that buying something simple involves this incredibly complex global system.
A system under immense economic pressure, with huge environmental questions hanging over it, and real human rights concerns embedded within it.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. What is the true cost of the goods you buy?
Beyond the price tag.
Exactly. What are the hidden systems, the compromises, the human and environmental stories behind that journey across the globe to your doorstep?